I'm John Carlin, chair of the Aspen Institute Cybersecurity and Technology program. And I also work at day job as the global chair of the crisis risk practice for Morrison Foerster. And in that day job, help companies respond to ransomware attacks, among other cybersecurity threats. It was a plague that I saw growing when I was serving as chief of staff to the director at the FBI and running the National Security Division at the Justice Department. But now with my new lens from inside the private sector, I realize just how little, in some respects, information that the government had on how widespread this growing issue of ransomware attacks on companies is. We have a very distinguished panel with us today that are fighting and working on this problem from different perspectives. But I thought maybe we'd start with former cyber agent who I knew from when he was in the field, who rose up to be the top cyber official at the FBI, and now is the president at CrowdStrike of their incident response services, Shawn Henry, to give us an overview of the threat.
Thanks, John. Wow. Threats from a cybersecurity perspective is pretty broad, but I think if we're going to focus on ransomware.
On ransomware threats, yeah.
Focusing on ransomware. For the last 20 years, what we've seen targeting networks, both at the government level, the commercial level, municipalities, et cetera, has primarily been the theft of PII, personally identifiable information. And what I've seen in the last couple of years is something that should be very disconcerting to everybody, and it is the disruptive and the destructive types of attacks that we've seen where data itself has been targeted. Previously, the data was used primarily from an espionage perspective, theft of intellectual property, or theft for financial gain, and the data was actually the chattel, right? The data was what was of value. Now the data is being used in ways to extort people through ransomware. Destructive attacks like NotPetya are certainly of major concern. But as we look at these organized crime groups that are targeting municipalities, major companies, governments at the state and local level primarily, they are having a tremendous impact, and I think organizations, the organized crime groups, have determined and understand that these agencies cannot survive without their data. They're not able to function. Municipalities aren't able to provide permits or licenses. We've seen whole cities shut down essentially over the course of days and weeks, having a tremendous impact on its citizens. I think as we look at these groups continuing to grow, primarily operating out of Eastern Europe, although we've seen groups out of Asia and groups even in the Middle East and South America, certainly within the US, groups of people that are collaborating to make new and developing pieces of malware, able to avoid the traditional defenses that are put in place by companies, and taking different pieces of code and constantly changing them to evade AV and other types of detection technology. I think that organizations need to do a lot more from a proactive side to prevent these types of attacks, to be much more aggressive just in terms of identification and detection. They need to take many more steps to prepare themselves for the likelihood of a ransomware attack where their data will be encrypted and rendered inoperable or inaccessible. They've got to prepare from a continuity of operations perspective, put protocols in place so that they can recover from an attack. We don't see this type of attack changing. We don't see it subsiding. In fact, it's increasing exponentially. And there certainly is a lot of effort that could be put in place by organizations to better prepare themselves. But the attackers are making hundreds of millions of dollars. They are successful. The chances of them being caught is relatively small, so the return on their limited investment is substantial. And they will continue to come until they're either disrupted or they find that it is not, it's not a benefit from a financial perspective. I don't think that day is coming anytime soon, which means organizations need to change their strategies to better prepare and better protect themselves.
So we're hearing from Shawn that the problem is getting worse, not better. And we've seen that municipalities are on the front lines of these attacks. And it's kind of hard to fathom in another circumstance watching a city make a large payment to an unknown bad guy overseas, and yet we've seen exactly that from major cities. Geoff, you're the Chief Information Security Officer for a slightly big target, the city of New York. So we're rooting for you today and hoping our lights stay on. But from your perspective, how is it that you deal with the threat that Shawn has outlined?
Thank you for the question, John. I couldn't agree more with what Shawn just said. I think it's helpful when you think about municipalities, especially since we're here in what we unabashedly say is the greatest city in the world, New York City. I wanted to give the audience today a flavor of how this city specifically is thinking about cybersecurity. Very much so, NYC Cyber Command has two primary missions. One mission is the enterprise defense. We defend the technologies that deliver services each and every day to New Yorkers. Those are services that New Yorkers rely on, and that's critical to be successful in that mission. The second part of the mission is a public-facing mission. I think the public-facing mission is incredibly germane to the topic that we're sitting here talking to you about today. The public-facing mission for my organization is to recognize that cybersecurity itself is a public safety issue. It's an essential service, and everything that we do in cybersecurity to help New Yorkers navigate away from threats that they may encounter in their digital lives, everything we do needs to respect their privacy. Sometimes when we think about the impact to municipality, to those core services, and of course in New York City, we are doing those things that enterprise programs do. We have a cyber threat intelligence team. We're looking at all the threats that happen globally. We learn from those threats. We help enrich our defenses. We are doing those things. But a lot of times we think about the impact of these events to New Yorkers themselves, the impact of these events to small businesses. Because a lot of those organizations don't have the types of capacity, the type of preparation, the type of ability to contend with the threat that a large enterprise may have. And on that note, I just want to highlight two initiatives that New York City has. One, every single place in New York City where the city itself provides free public Wi-Fi, we use a non-for-profit free DNS protection solution called Quad9, because we have a belief that if there's something that we can do, if we can identify in the internet that known cyber threat, we're not going to make judgments about where you browse, et cetera. But if we know we can do something for free that will better protect you, we should do that. And that's for all New Yorkers to help guard them from ransomware. The other thing we did was we released a free threat detection app for the mobile space, because we think that the government has a role here to do things to help people navigate away from the things that they're encountering on the internet that can take down those core services that they need to perform their daily life.
It's really helpful. And you raise two issues there, Geoff. And turn to Maz, the Deputy Director of the agency at the Department of Homeland Security, whose mission it is to not respond to incidents to catch bad guys, but to help companies, cities, respond to the attack itself, to get back up and running and to help prevent the attack. But we heard two trends there. So one, from the perspective of the city, that the city is taking upon itself somewhat the responsibility of providing for free services to residents that will help protect them so that they don't end up being victims of ransomware. And two, wondering, as we move towards smart cities, and we're seeing it change so that our cars, possibly our pacemakers, the way we communicate, are all working off municipal grids. And we're watching this plague of city after city getting hit by ransomware and being unable to respond to the current situation. What is the role of Homeland Security, and when am I getting my free software?
I'll get to that, John. But first off, thank you for the Aspen Institute for the invitation here. Let me start by just saying how we kind of see the problem set. I spent a good portion of this past summer with governors out at NGA in Utah, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, state legislators at their annual convention. And as those officials came up to me, they didn't want to talk necessarily about elections. They didn't want to talk about industrial control systems to the utilities. They didn't want to talk about federal networks or even some of the other cybersecurity problems that exist. They wanted to talk about ransomware. And so, to Shawn's point in terms of just the increasing severity and the vast number of increase of the attacks. This has gone from being what may some have considered a nuisance some years ago. I don't think we ever did. But it was here and there, even in international NotPetya. Well, it wasn't here in the United States, but now it is. And this is a bona fide menace to really our society and way of life when you look at how cities have been locked down, how small businesses are being really crippled. And I think we got to start from square one and just raising awareness, because I don't know that every municipal, state, local, tribal, territorial official appreciates the severity of the threat and all the different attack vectors that come into it. Now, the good thing is, and this is where CISA comes in, is that we can do a lot to help them prepare for this type of threat, to get strong. We think about what the intelligence community does to study and to analyze and monitor the bad guys, and Shawn's former colleagues at the FBI or the Secret Service are out there to catch the bad guys. Well, we exist at DHS to help you get stronger against the bad guys, to be more informed, to be better prepared, and ultimately be more resilient, because the threat's not going away. And I actually, even though there's a whole host of things that we can do, from vulnerability assessments to making sure that systems are upgraded and patches are patched, and you're training your work, all the whole host of things that we do for free, and other companies will do it as well, we actually are not going to be able to defend our way out of this problem. And I think what is needed at the federal side is a more concerted effort to use all those mechanisms of government in terms of how the IC collects against ransomware bad actors. What are the diplomatic mechanisms that we maybe could use more in terms of combating this? A lot of this is all contracted through cybercurrency. What are we doing to try to better understand avenues to disrupt and take down some of the transactions? So I think that on the federal side, there's a lot of services that both CISA and others will offer to get stakeholders more resilient, but I think this is a collective defense problem, and I think there's more work to be done on the federal side in doing that.
So we're hearing from the Department of Homeland Security that our current ransomware situation is a menace to our society and way of life. And given that, are we doing enough? And why is it, I still find this, the majority, I think, of companies don't report when they've been hit with ransomware, and individuals, to anyone at all. So you can't keep track of it, and some of them are making payments without reporting it.
Yeah, I think that, look, it's really hard to get people to report, and this is a problem because we have a blame the victim mentality when it comes to these kinds of attacks, and frankly, cybersecurity breaches generally, right? The attitude is that was a mighty short firewall you were wearing. How did you let the bad guy up onto your system? And I think that there's a real problem that we're thinking about, right? Whose fault is it that we didn't patch, that we left vulnerabilities out there, and not who is the bad guy who is waiting for the Bitcoin to flow into their wallet, and how do we identify and impose consequences on that human bad guy? And I think that we are really far behind on that, right? We have, at Third Way, we've taken a look at this and we've tried to look at the data. Based on the FBI's own data, right, they received 350,000 reports of malicious cyber incidents into their IC3 database last year. And we looked at their data, and we see that of reported incidents, only 3 in 1,000 see an arrest. That is an incredibly low number for how well we're doing against the number of malicious incidents. However, the FBI estimates that they're off by an undercount of 1 in 10, which would mean over 3 million incidents. Well, Gallup did a survey, and they asked the American people how many people have been victimized by cybercrime, and they were very specific about what kind of crime they were talking about. Their answer, based on polling the American public, was 1 in 4 American households, which would mean 31.5 million victims. So potentially the FBI's undercount is off by a factor of 100, and if only 3 in 1,000 reported incidents are seeing successful law enforcement action on disruption, what we've got is near impunity for the malicious actor. And it is law enforcement, more so than any of the other agencies, that is currently empowered to be able to do something about it. And John, I feel like you were really revolutionary in your efforts at the Department of Justice to really indict and try to bring to justice some of these bad actors. But we need a lot more of that.
And let me ask, throw it up to the panel, possibly start with Shawn. So what is it that companies are getting wrong that you wish you could tell them? on day one before they get hit with the ransomware attack that they should be thinking about right now?
I think it's about being proactive. You've got to have defense in depth, put your defenses in place, but you've got to be proactive and try to detect these attacks before they result in the type of devastating impact that we see time and time and time again. That requires organizations to be preparing for the inevitable. These attacks are not going away. As Mieke just described, they operate with impunity. The chance of being caught is slim to none, and they recognize that they operate in a space that allows them to be aggressive with little chance of seeing an impact to them. So it doesn't mean there aren't a lot of men and women working really hard to bring them to justice. There are so many variables that allows that to happen. Therefore, unfortunately, it relies on the corporations to protect their own infrastructure, and they've got to do it in a much more aggressive way. Proactive is the right word. It's not just about hoping that you have AV in place that's going to catch a piece of ransomware, because it's being changed on a regular basis. They're able to avoid the algorithms that AV has. You need technology put in place that is able to find the anomalous behavior and be able to stop that anomalous behavior before it launches its payload. You've got to take steps like tabletop exercises so that everybody in the organization across the enterprise understands what their role is when there's an incident. You have to have a continuity of operations plan in place so that you've got backups. And the backups, by the way, aren't connected to the network. Right? They've got to be standalone systems so that you can actually recover from something that you know is pristine. These steps are best practices. Most organizations, or many organizations that are at the top of their field, are implementing these, and I think that there's a lot more to learn. To Geoff's point, though, I think we've got a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that don't have the expertise, they don't necessarily have the resources, and they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the general understanding of what's occurring, they don't have the awareness. And there are protocols in place, as Geoff described, that might help those smaller companies better protect themselves. At the end of the day, everyone's part of the ecosystem, and it's always about the weak link. And if you've got organizations that are getting infected, they might be somehow connected to other organizations, other enterprises, beyond just ransomware, other types of malware that allows for ingress, you're going to have problems. So it really is a community effort about all these groups and organizations connected, working in a fundamentally stronger and more strategic way.
Just to add to that, I think there are a whole host of things that organizations are missing. Oftentimes, especially with startup businesses, there's a rush to get networks up and running, to get systems up, and security may not be the driver in terms of how those networks are configured. And then over time, those networks, those software applications are not patched and upgraded. I also don't think, and to Shawn's point about awareness, that the workforce is being adequately trained. It's one thing just to have a PowerPoint deck on ransomware on your shared drive and make sure everyone looks at it once a year. That's not really training, right? There's got to be a concerted effort to ensure that every member of your organization understands the threats, understands the risks. It used to be the worst thing an employee could do at your company or office is to jam up the copier or spill coffee on the laptop or do something stupid at a holiday party. But now one employee with one keystroke can really jack up your entire enterprise. I don't think that's appreciated. It certainly is at the large companies. As Shawn mentioned, the investments are there. There's also, I think, a notion that this is not going to happen to me. And we know that whether they're through phishing campaigns or they're doing recon and then doing targeted strikes, they're going after those organizations, whether municipalities or companies, that they assume or infer have not invested sufficiently.
It's a great point worth repeating, because I hear often, depending on the sector, that I think some sectors think, I'm not a bank, I don't have a lot of money, I'm never going to get hit by ransomware, I don't need to plan for it. But that's not what you're seeing.
It's not. I would take the perspective, if you own a jewelry store, that inventory is what is of value to your company, and you're likely going to have a security guard and cameras and protect that. If your data is important to your organization, why wouldn't you invest in the protection of that data? And again, to Shawn's point, if you're backing it up, if you have a playbook, if you're hit with ransomware, it's a bad day, but it's not devastating because you can migrate that backup data onto your networks. There are folks who can help you do that, and that is a big mitigation measure. So the frustrating thing about ransomware is there's so much we do on the front end. It's not left of boom in cyber, it's left of buzz or zzz or whatever, but a lot we can do to prepare for before an incident. And then if you're prepared, once an incident happens, the recovery should not be as painful.
Geoff, we heard Shawn talk about tabletop, and I think Matt alluded to the same idea. Could you explain a little bit for the audience what a tabletop is? Is it something you do as a municipality?
Sure, certainly. I think both Shawn and Matt just made really important points to highlight, and one of those is, of course, tabletopping. So when you think about a municipality, Shawn mentioned an ecosystem. So the ecosystem of a municipality is more than the services that are provided by the municipal government. You know, when it comes down to it, when you think about New York, our success as a city hinges on the cyber hygiene of a lot more than those systems that are operated by the city government. We have financial services, media, transportation, all kinds of things. And to do well to the common good, in order that all core services are delivered successfully to New Yorkers and you're able to absorb the impact of these very dangerous events, everybody has to do their job. So I highlight those points. I think are very important. So when it comes to tabletops, when it comes down to it, this is an exercise. It is not necessarily new to cyber, right? We didn't invent this. When I think about it from a municipality, there's great partners here, and there's great partners like partners in other municipalities. Our emergency management, our police department, our fire department, our emergency responders. These disciplines practice each and every day. These disciplines invest heavily in the training and retraining and reskilling and certification. These disciplines invest heavily just in the people that are going to directly respond, but then also in exercising the apparatus of decision authority that needs to come together to mitigate and absorb the impact of any type of event that might interrupt the way a New Yorker is going to carry on their day. I'd highlight, if you think about it, and of course DHS does a lot of this work, you think about other disciplines like responding to a major storm, et cetera. All of that apparatus can be flexed, exercised, tabletopped, and it can be scenario-based. It can be a tabletop that is technically based, where you actually have your fingers on keyboards and you have a red team and a blue team, and they're defending a fake network. All of these things can come to bear. And most importantly is that you don't do these things from a silo perspective. Everybody may need to do an exercise given their own task, but it's pretty important to say, how does this whole communication chain go up to the decision authority so that when it comes down to it, everybody can move in unison. And that applies to the municipality, it applies to the private sector, it applies to the state, it applies to the federal sector, all working in unison.
It's a great point. I think you're emphasizing there the corporate governance aspects, because sometimes people think this is a purely technical exercise, but that important decisions need to be made, and that means the decision makers need to think about it before they're in the midst of an actual crisis. Mieke, one of those decisions is whether or not to pay. Mm-hmm. And if you intentionally make a payment to a terrorist group, that's illegal. That's material support to terrorism, even if they're extorting you through ransomware. If you unintentionally make a payment to a sanctioned group, then arguably you're falling afoul of OFAC regulations, Treasury regulations that prevent payments, and that's strict liability, so that doesn't require intent. If you make a payment to a straight-up criminal group, it is not against any law or regulation. Should it be?
Yeah, so I think decisions on whether or not to pay are really tough for people who've been attacked, right? You see this in the municipalities all the time. The cost of mitigation, the criminals are very smart. They're pricing their ransoms under the cost of mitigation and the cost of secondary consequences. So economically, the smarter decision is to pay. But I think there are a lot of things that affect the decision whether or not to pay, right? One is this, as we saw with WannaCry, a lot of these entities that are conducting ransomware attacks are in fact inside of sanctioned countries. So the Iranians, the North Koreans, if it turns out later that you've paid a ransom to a country that's sanctioned, as John says, you may have a potential sanctions violation. There's some real legal liability there. And then there's another factor in the decision whether or not to pay, and that's this company's rush to get cyber insurance to try and hedge against the costs of what seem like will be inevitable attacks. There are questions about what the insurer is incentivizing or disincentivizing you to do, right? If your car gets stolen, you need a police report to be able to claim. What happens in cyberspace? Does your insurer prefer that you pay because it's a lower cost? Or do they say you need to report because we want to try and make sure that this is real and we need to make sure that you're going to law enforcement? To the extent that people are not paying, or sorry, are not reporting, it makes it much more difficult for law enforcement to be able to go after the attacker who's waiting for the Bitcoin, be able to arrest that person and seek restitution from them. But if law enforcement's ability to do that, because this person is located elsewhere, is near impossible, and we don't have the mechanisms necessary to really go at that human, then that feels like a futile exercise, right? Okay, I report to law enforcement, I've told them what's happening, this person is in Indonesia or Moldova, and like we don't have enough collection on this person, we may never actually see someone in court and then be able to recover off of whatever cryptocurrencies they've accumulated. It feels like maybe the rational play is to pay and keep quiet about it. But I think that this is actually a really big public policy debate that needs to happen in our country about what is the right answer and what are we trying to do, because the more that people pay, the more that people get insurance that allows them to pay, the more lucrative this marketplace is for the attacker. And I think that that's a bad situation, because you will see the attacks continue to increase.
I just have a slightly different take on that, which is no, you should not pay, but I don't even like answering that question. You know, the question that I ask in response when people ask that is, I mean, if you're asking that question, ostensibly you have not been hit yet, unless you got hit like this morning, right? So if you're asking that question, the question I'd ask you back is, well, have you upgraded your network? Have you patched your systems? Have you done vulnerability assessments? Have you trained your staff? Have you taken all those things I talked about earlier? And then if you've done all those things and you get hit and you've backed up your data, I think the question kind of answers itself. You don't necessarily have to pay because it's easy to migrate your backup data onto the networks. And that sounds simplistic, and not everyone can make those investments. But why would we want to perpetuate or propel a criminal business model by adding more fuel to its engine? And the point that you bring up in terms of do we need to look at different policies and laws in terms of conveying monetary transactions to transnational criminal organizations, I think that is worth exploring.
I think we've got the laws in place. I think what we need is a protocol that allows there to be attribution, identification of who the criminal groups are, and then for law enforcement to successfully execute that in collaboration with foreign partners, because it requires that international piece. I think it's not typical that you're going to find a police officer walking the beat, show up at somebody's local bagel shop, and they were hit with ransomware and the 2 computers that they've got there, be able to take a report and then to expect that somebody's going to get caught. There needs to be an ecosystem that's developed that allows for the successful transmission of clear intelligence, evidentiary in nature, that will allow for attribution, and then that somebody's responsible for executing that. Typically, it's going to be at the international level, or it's going to require some international coordination. That's what these groups look like. And until we have that infrastructure in place, until we have the ability to actually disrupt the organized crime groups and the actors, this activity will continue indefinitely. And that's going to create havoc for these companies going forward.
So I heard a couple things. So Matt, you seem to be saying in part that there's not an overfocus, but there's a focus on prevention. But when it comes to this new threat, unlike the theft of data, where once that happens, it happens, that there needs to be a focus on resilience.
Absolutely. I'd say preparedness, not prevention. I think, to my earlier point, we're not going to defend our way out of it, but we need to become as resilient as we possibly can. So if, in fact, we are hit, the damage is much less severe and the recovery process is much easier. Now, large companies, large municipalities can make those investments. What we're trying to do at CISA is create some toolkits for more rural communities, rural school districts, some of the small businesses that may not be able to do all those things that I outlined in terms of cyber essentials. So that's kind of where our focus is trying to get outreach to outside the large cities and companies so that everyone can at least have those basic kind of starter kit to get themselves more resilient.
And from the perspective, Geoff, of a city, how are you working with smaller, mid-sized companies? What's the answer? They don't have the resources to necessarily invest in resilience. And so is there something that you can offer as a city solution for businesses inside New York? And what about the members of our audience, consumers at home, whose computers are also getting regularly locked up now with ransomware demands?
I think Matt makes an important point. There's guidance that DHS has put out there that very much can help an organization, no matter its size and scale, walk through those preparatory measures. But I think beyond that, there's a whole ecosystem of what you could call toolkits, guidance, et cetera, out there that can assist even a small business in doing maybe some of the basics, multi-factor authentication, the backups that are off network. What I might highlight is that anyone who is responsible and accountable for the success of their organization should prioritize doing those things on the thing that is core to your strategy. It could be a business, it could be a municipality, it could be a health network, et cetera. What is core to what you're doing, and prioritize some of those defensive measures and those backups in case you have a bad day. And again, there is a number of different guidances out there that are toolkit in nature. As I noted before, here in the city, we have a free threat detection app. If you go to secure.nyc, you can get information on that. That's secure.nyc. There's resources like the Quad 9 DNS security solution I highlight. It's free. You can set a business router to it. You can set a home router to it. So people are developing those solutions, and I think that's very encouraging.
I wanted to follow up on what Shawn was saying, Mieke, but let's make it real. So right now, we're saying there isn't an adequate law enforcement response, if I hear you right, on attribution.
I want to be clear.
Okay.
There are a lot of men and women that are working really hard to do it. I don't think the infrastructure is set up based on the totality of the threat to allow them to effectively do what they're charged to do, and that there needs to be changes because the threat is different, right? If somebody walks up to a store and throws a brick through a window, there's a high likelihood that the guy that threw the brick was standing right there. So we know that he's close by. There's a lot that can be done to identify and bring him into custody. If that same store owner is hit with ransomware, the chances of the person that did that standing there and a police officer being able to respond is that.
Let me follow up with three, building off the brick through a window. So number one, in our case, right, it's someone saying, if you don't pay me $5, I'm going to throw a brick through your window. And as we know, there is a long and distinguished history of that happening in New York. I think we both worked similar cases. Number two would be they break your window. What are the incentives now, either to keep them from throwing another brick and breaking in another window? When you break the window, you do notify usually your insurer, and the insurer requires you to contact the police. Why isn't that happening here? And number three, when you know who to call. You know to call 911 when the brick goes through your window, but who do you call in cyber? And then I'm going to add one fourth on our brick window just to talk about how confusing this is, which is they don't actually tell you to pay $5, right? They tell you to convert currency into digital currency and then make a payment to somebody overseas. And most businesses don't know how to do that and aren't maintaining those funds. So what do you do in this environment?
They're good, though, because they provide instructions on how to get a Bitcoin account.
Right. So look, it's very clear the person who's throwing the brick is not right standing on the sidewalk. They're sitting somewhere on a beach in Croatia, and they're throwing 1,000 bricks at 1,000 windows with a click of a finger, right? And so how do you figure out how to stop that person? Because one person doesn't pay, okay, there's a whole bunch of other attacks out there. The challenge, right, for law enforcement is that the person in Albany and the person in Sacramento and the person in Tampa, that local PD, they're all getting the same brick window situation. And someone's calling to report if they can. They're calling all kinds of places. They're calling their local sheriff, they're calling their local police department, they're calling their FBI field office, they're calling the Secret Service. Part of the challenge is it's the same brick, but we don't know it's the same brick, right? And so how do we ensure that law enforcement can talk to each other instead of having thousands of different law enforcement jurisdictions of very differing abilities chasing after the same brick thrower and wasting resources on that? How do we build an information sharing backbone that allows you to say, aha, there's one guy out there throwing 1,000 bricks at windows all over the world, and I'm going to figure out who this person is. Because these are things, they're easier to do than you think because of the availability of the tools on the dark web, but there's actually a limited number of people who have the skill to be able to pull off this kind of attack. And these are not crimes of passion. These are people who, right, if you saw the movie Catch Me If You Can, right, like you want to try and find those people and help solve some of the workforce crises that we have at DHS and FBI and other places, if you can flip them. There are some real challenges here about how we come together on this, but when you look at where law enforcement is resourced, we have huge amount of resources in counterterrorism where we've built up built up infrastructure to be able to detect networks, but we have not done the same on cyber. And there's a real question about how government organizes itself, as Shawn is saying, and puts the infrastructure in place to be able to address these cases. How do you build up the workforce skill? How do you build up the information sharing networks? How do you build up partner capacity in other countries? How do you make sure that the State Department is prioritizing which people need to be extradited and to where? How do we lure people out of the places where they are and actually be able to put handcuffs on them? But we haven't had that whole of government strategic effort to think about what do we need to do here. And that's really, I think, the piece that's missing, right? We call it analog cops, digital robbers. How do we make sure that the cops are digital too? And we are not there yet.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience. There'll be, you'll see coming down our microphones. So if you just raise your hand, they'll bring a microphone to you. As we wait, question, what role now for third parties who are collecting intelligence on these ransomware threats? I read more when we're trying to help with the private sector from third-party security companies than I do from government products when it comes to what's going on in the latest in ransomware.
I think the challenge sometimes, it's about, when you're talking about intelligence comes down to collection. Right? Where do you have access? What do you have access to? What's important? Do you know what to collect against? What's important to your constituency, to your readership, to those that are consuming the intelligence? It always comes down to collection. I think that the government has done a great job in the last couple of years, especially taking intelligence that may be collected in a classified way, declassifying and getting specific indicators out to the private sector, raising awareness about new attacks, et cetera. But that still is sometimes cumbersome just because of it's just bureaucracy of government, right? There's a lot of things, there's privacy concerns, there are sources and methods, there's a whole host of issues. I think in the private sector, it's a little bit more streamlined where you can take intelligence oftentimes and turn it around much more quickly and get it to the very specific people that require it, as opposed to sometimes the government is much more broad. So that's a challenge for them. The most important piece, though, is to get the intelligence into the hands of the consumers, those that are responsible for protecting the networks, because you can't defend against what you don't know. You need to have the intelligence that allows you to see what's coming around the corner, not what hit you 2 weeks ago. You need to see what's coming so you can defend against it proactively and mitigate the consequences of the attack.
And we rely on those third-party providers as well. We have, we monitor civilian federal networks so we can see what's on, trying to hit in, but that's it. So in terms of the private sector, state, local, we rely on a lot of commercial providers, and that's the example of that public-private partnership that's really needed. We've got a program called Automated Indicator Sharing, AIS, where we're sharing near real-time indicators of compromise, and so programs like that try to build that bridge.
Great.
Hey, I've got 2 questions here for the panel. The first is, should there be a referendum or a discussion in the municipalities' use of public funds to pay for these ransoms? And the second question, Shawn, you made a great point about the insurance companies reimbursing and this. Mieke, you also made a great point in saying that the insurance companies are doing a calculation. They're saying the amount of the ransom, if it is greater than cost of recovery. My question to the panel is, number 1, on the misuse of public funds for ransom, and 2, should the insurance companies stop paying the ransoms? Because it seems like we have lost the lessons from the 70s and 80s. We will not negotiate with terrorists, and that's where it stops. And now we're seeing a lot more payments being made.
Nice.
So I don't know what the right answer is about insurance companies and what they should do and whether or not we need a national policy on this. I think it's hard to couple a policy of don't pay if we don't have the adequate response that says we're going to go get those bad guys for you. Right? I do think that there are real issues about incentivization and what this means for the criminal, right, if you continue to pay. But I think that that's a national debate that we need to have, and I think municipalities will deal with this as they come, but municipalities also struggle with this cost-benefit analysis, right? How much does it cost me to hire high-quality IT personnel and upgrade off of Windows 95 or whatever it is that I've been running, right, in limited municipal budgets. And then you look at the cost of paying the ransom, and then you look at the cost of mitigation. Municipal budgets are really strapped, and I think for a lot of places, it's a really hard conversation to have. I'm not sure that it's a decision that the public is actually informed enough to put to a referendum, and I think that that's a real challenge.
Great. Final.
I could add to it, just from a context perspective, I would encourage any enterprise to think about a ransomware event within the context of the entire threat landscape and any type of attack that you could attribute to being operationally disruptive. So to a certain extent, I think the criminals have in some ways confused us, because what they're doing is disabling your core service or disabling your core objective that you're reaching by your ability to compute. And the more that we think about it as that destructive event and plan and prepare, then the more it fits within the greater conversation around cybersecurity, which we've all heard before, which is when it comes down to it, there will be a bad day. And when there's a bad day, it's about how you respond. And to a certain extent, I do think the criminals have confused us. Let's treat this as operationally destructive, and let's respond.
Great. I want to please join me in thanking our panelists today. Really appreciated it.